December 17, 1944, 05:30 hours, near Honsfeld, Belgium. The engine of the Tiger tank coughed, rattled, and went silent. And SS Obersturmbannvorschütze zum Peiper slammed his fist against the hatch, the metallic echo breaking the icy silence of dawn. His driver, an Untersturmführer Werner V. Bell, tried again to coax the Maybach's 700 horsepower engine back to life. Nothing. The fuel gauge pointed to empty. And from his compartment, Hauptscharführer called up with barely restrained panic. The reserve tank was dry too, and Peiper climbed out of his command vehicle, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Around him stretched the spearhead of the Waffen, SS. 67 tanks, and 149 half-tracks, and almost 1,000 of Germany's best soldiers, assembled for Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive. Operation Watch on the Rhine. Yet this massive armored column sat paralyzed, not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Through the fog of morning, and Peiper could make out the outlines of Honsfeld, a small but crucial American supply point, once held by the 99th Infantry Division. And the Americans had fled in such haste they left fires burning in barrels, hot coffee steaming in cups, and, most astonishing of all, and row after row of jerrycans, thousands of them, olive-drab American fuel containers, stood stacked like a miraculous offering from the god of war. And, approaching with reverence, Peiper's adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruel, pried open one can and inhaled the sharp scent of high-octane gasoline. And it was exactly what they needed. His men scrambled to begin refueling. Peiper moved among the cans, mentally tallying the quantity. And the arithmetic stunned him. Nearly 50,000 gallons, enough to propel his entire Kampfgruppe to the Meuse River, and enough to possibly change the fate of the offensive itself. And the Americans had abandoned in this single forward depot more fuel than many German divisions had received in half a year. And yet, as Peiper oversaw the frantic refueling, a grim realization settled over him like the mist. If the Americans could afford to walk away from such abundance, and if they could discard what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then the war was already lost. Germany had not simply miscalculated, it had failed to grasp the very nature of its enemy. Only 6 months earlier, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, had warned Hitler in a report that should have ended any thought of large-scale offensives. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated Germany's synthetic fuel industry. In April 1944, the Luna Works produced 175,000 tons of fuel. By September, just 5,000. Hydrogenation plants Elitz, Bleckhammer, and Brex were operating at less than a tenth of capacity. The numbers left no room for hope. Mechanized warfare was unsustainable. The contrast with America was staggering. In 1944, the United States pumped 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, and even counting synthetic plants and captured Romanian fields, managed only 33 million, less than 2% of U.S. output. The Reich was waging a mechanized war with horse-drawn wagons, while America drowned its armies in oil. And Major Friedrich Zimmermann of the Wehrmacht's logistics staff had calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. And Hitler allocated 5 million, but due to transportation bottlenecks, barely half that amount was delivered. From the beginning, German high command knew their advance depended not on their own supply lines, but on capturing Allied stockpiles. It was not a strategy of strength, but of desperation. The Americans, by contrast, had engineered a logistical miracle. Pipelines under the Channel, codenamed PLUTO, and pumped millions of gallons directly into France. The Red Ball Express, an endless convoy of trucks, delivered 500 tons of supplies daily to the front. And by December 1944, U.S. forces in Europe consumed 1.2 million gallons of fuel every day, and still received more than they used, and building reserves even as they fought. Peiper understood fuel's importance better than most. At just 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen SS, decorated with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front. There, He had learned the unforgiving lesson in modern war: fuel was more vital than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the shore punkt, the decisive thrust of the Ardennes attack. Yet his very orders betrayed the fatal flaw: conserve fuel and capture Allied fuel, depend on chance rather than certainty. The mathematics of failure were baked into the plan from the start. On December 18th, and the second day of the offensive, Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium. Their armored spearhead moved with ruthless efficiency, overrunning villages, ambushing convoys, and scattering American defenders. Every hour, every mile gained, however, burned precious gallons of fuel they did not possess. And, near the town of Stavelot, Peiper struck what seemed like salvation. Intelligence reported a vast Allied fuel dump, over 3 million gallons stored in above-ground tanks. Enough, Peiper realized, and not just to fuel his advance, but to keep the entire 6th SS Panzer Army moving for weeks. His men approached with tense anticipation, and already imagining their tanks and half-tracks roaring forward once more with full tanks. But the Americans had anticipated the danger, and as Peiper's vanguard closed in, engineers set the depot ablaze. Columns of fire leapt into the sky, explosions ripped the air, and a firestorm engulfed the installation. 3 million gallons of fuel turned into a churning inferno that lit the night like a second sun. And Peiper and his officers could only watch as their hopes went up in flames, and the black smoke rising above Stavelot was more than burning gasoline. It was the physical destruction of Germany's last chance. And men who had fought through years of war stood transfixed, realizing that logistics, not courage or tactics, was determining their fate. And, by the standards of Germany's fuel-starved army, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. To Peiper, every gallon represented a lifeline. Yet here, and the Americans had torched enough fuel to keep the entire Wehrmacht in the field for weeks, and they could afford to destroy it without hesitation. To grasp the magnitude, one must compare the numbers. In December 1944, the entire German army in the West had reserves of barely 15 million gallons. U.S. and forces in the European theater held more than 400 million. For every gallon available to a German panzer crew, the Americans had nearly 30. While German divisions rationed every drop, U.S. and forces operated with excess so vast they sometimes dumped fuel into ditches simply to make room for fresh deliveries. Consider the irony. And the Red Ball Express, manned largely by African-American drivers, hauled more fuel in a single week than the entire German army could capture in a month. And pipelines and depots ensured a steady torrent of supply, no matter the setbacks at the front. To Eisenhower and his commanders, and fuel was a resource so plentiful they measured it in millions of tons. To Hitler and his generals, it was the very currency of survival. And Peiper's staff understood the contrast with bitter clarity. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruhl reportedly muttered, "And we are starving in the land of plenty." Their panzers, technological marvels of armor and firepower, and were being strangled not by Allied guns but by empty tanks. The Waffen SS, feared across Europe, had become beggars in search of gasoline. The tragedy was not lost on the rank and file, and soldiers joked darkly about fighting for Operation Gas Can. Tank crews pushed their machines to the limit, and only to abandon them by the roadside when fuel ran out. Each Tiger lost without a fight was not just a tactical blow, but a psychological wound. And at headquarters, the arithmetic grew grim. Every kilometer advanced meant more fuel burned, and every hour wasted searching for depots brought them closer to paralysis. And German commanders had gambled that surprise and audacity would compensate for shortages, but the gamble was unraveling before their eyes. Meanwhile, and the Americans treated logistics as an art form. They understood the wars are not won solely by bullets and bravery, but by the invisible machinery of supply. And trucks, trains, pipelines, depots, these were the true engines of victory. While Peiper's men scoured villages for abandoned cans, the U.S. and First Army consumed 500,000 gallons daily, delivered on schedule, without interruption. And the burning fuel tanks of Stavelot symbolized more than a lost opportunity. They revealed the deeper truth. Germany was fighting a war it could not sustain, and the Reich had armored divisions without gasoline, aircraft without aviation fuel, factories without coal. The Americans, by contrast, possessed a supply system so vast that even deliberate destruction of millions of gallons barely dented their reserves. And Peiper's offensive was still underway, his men still fought with ferocity, but the outcome was already written in smoke above Stavelot. And the Battle of the Bulge was not merely a clash of armies, it was a collision between scarcity and abundance, and between a nation fighting on fumes and a superpower waging war with overflowing reserves. By December 20th, Peiper's spearhead had lost its momentum, and the initial breakthrough that had seemed so promising was stalling. The reason was painfully simple: fuel. Without it, and the Tigers and Panthers became immobile fortresses, magnificent but useless. Half-tracks stood silent, artillery pieces sat idle, and the once proud column that had struck fear into every opponent was reduced to a crawling, starving force. The brutality of the advance did not go unnoticed. At Malmedy, on December 17th, Peiper's men had executed over 80 American prisoners of war. The massacre, intended as a show of ruthless determination, and instead hardened American resolve. Word spread quickly through Allied lines: surrender to Peiper's SS was a death sentence. U.S. troops dug in deeper, and fought harder, and delayed him in every crossroad. And what had once been meant as psychological warfare became a curse that shadowed the Kampfgruppe wherever it went. Each day, Peiper's situation worsened, and tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed by enemy fire, but because their engines coughed, sputtered, and went cold. And crews smashed sights and breaches before leaving their machines behind, a bitter act of denial that those steel beasts would never again roar in battle. And by December 22nd, nearly half of Peiper's armor lay scattered along Belgian roadsides, lifeless monuments to the arithmetic of fuel. And American counterattacks tightened around him. At Stoumont, U.S. forces blocked his advance. At Troyes, Ponce, they blew bridges in his face. And each attempt to push forward consumed more gasoline, and each failed thrust left him weaker. German high command had promised reinforcements and supplies, but the roads were clogged, the skies dominated by Allied aircraft, and the promised convoys never arrived. On December 23rd, Peiper made the fateful decision to break out westward. His maps showed small roads that might bypass the Americans, but maneuvering Tigers and Panthers through narrow, icy lanes drained fuel at a punishing rate. Vehicles broke down, bogged down, or simply ran out of gas and were left behind. By Christmas Eve, his Kampfgruppe, once the sharp tip of the Ardennes offensive, was reduced to fragments. And the Americans pressed relentlessly. By December 24th, Peiper and 800 men found themselves trapped in the village of La Glaise. Surrounded, cut off, and with barely any ammunition left, they faced annihilation. Peiper tried to radio for relief. Silence. He requested airdrops. None came, and German high command, consumed by the collapsing offensive, had abandoned him as surely as the fuel tanks had run dry. On the night of December 24th, Peiper gave the order. They would abandon everything: tanks, vehicles, heavy weapons, and attempt to escape on foot. And crews poured water into the ends of their Tigers to seize them up, ensuring they could not be captured intact. And the men gathered what little they could carry and slipped into the frozen darkness. Behind them, nearly 135 armored vehicles, including the most formidable tanks of the Third Reich, lay silent. For 4 days, Peiper's men trekked through forests and fields, harried by American patrols, starving, freezing, exhausted. On December 27th, they stumbled back across German lines. Of the original 5,000 men and 67 tanks that had formed his Kampfgruppe, fewer than 800 survivors returned, stripped of their equipment, broken in spirit. And The collapse of Kampfgruppe Peiper was not merely the failure of a single unit. It symbolized the unraveling of Hitler's last gamble, and the Ardennes offensive, launched with such secrecy and boldness, had been crippled not by tactical defeat but by logistics, and German strategy had been built on a hope, the hope of capturing American fuel. When that hope went up in smoke at Stavelot and was denied at crossroads and depots across Belgium, the offensive was doomed. By early January 1945, and the Bulge in Allied lines had been erased, German losses were staggering: 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 100,000 casualties, and irreplaceable aircraft and fuel expended in vain. The Wehrmacht would never again mount an offensive in the West. The road to the Rhine lay open for the Allies. For Peiper, survival meant disgrace, and the Waffen SS officer, once celebrated as a brilliant commander, now bore the shadow of Malmedy. After the war, he was tried and convicted for war crimes, and he would live a hunted man until 1976, when former resistance fighters killed him in France. His name, once tied to daring armored thrusts, and became forever stained by massacre and defeat. But the true lesson of his fate lay not in his reputation, but in the reality that no amount of valor and brutality or tactical genius could overcome the merciless logic of supply. His Tigers had not been destroyed by American firepower, and they had been defeated by empty fuel tanks. His men had not surrendered in battle. They had been starved by the arithmetic of gallons and tons. The Battle of the Bulge revealed what had been true all along in modern war: logistics is destiny. When the Ardennes offensive began, and Hitler believed he was reenacting 1940, a lightning strike through the Ardennes that would smash Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. In his mind, and tanks and surprise would triumph again. What he refused to see was that 1944 was not 1940. Germany was no longer a rising power fueled by fresh conquests, and it was a bleeding empire running on fumes. Albert Speer had warned him with precise numbers: synthetic fuel plants lay in ruins, coal supplies were dwindling, and transportation networks were shattered by Allied bombing. Yet Hitler ignored arithmetic for ideology. He gambled everything on a bold stroke, but boldness cannot refill fuel tanks, and ideology cannot replace supply chains. The Ardennes offensive at its heart, and was not a battle of tanks and infantry, it was a battle of gallons. Every mile a Tiger advanced cost 5 gallons of fuel. Every bridge blown by American engineers was measured not in concrete but in wasted gasoline as German columns idled or detoured. By contrast, and every American depot, pipeline, and convoy added strength not just at the front but across the entire war effort. To understand the contrast, and one must look beyond the battlefield. In 1944, the United States produced more trucks than Germany produced rifles, and Detroit alone manufactured more tanks than the entire Reich. America's oil wells, stretching from Texas to California, provided oceans of fuel. German panzers rationed every drop. American Shermans guzzled freely and kept moving. It was not just a difference of scale, but of philosophy. The U.S. and Army planned operations around guaranteed supply. The Wehrmacht launched offensives hoping to capture what it could not produce, and the Battle of the Bulge proved the final verdict. And Germany's last great armored thrust collapsed, not because its soldiers lacked bravery or skill. They fought with ferocity in the forests of Belgium, and it collapsed because war in the 20th century was no longer won by maneuvers alone. It was won by the invisible arteries of logistics, and by the steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and food. In the smoldering wreckage left behind by Kampfgruppe Peiper, and one could see the entire story of the war distilled into a single image: rows of abandoned Tigers, the most advanced tanks of their era, and left useless because their engines were silent. Technology without fuel was junk. Valor without supply was futility. Strategy without logistics was fantasy. The Americans, by contrast, demonstrated what modern warfare required. Their soldiers were brave, yes, but their bravery was supported by an industrial machine that dwarfed every opponent. For every German shell, the Americans had 5. And for every gallon of gasoline Germany dreamed of, the Americans poured rivers into their depots. The Red Ball Express thundered day and night, and delivering life to the front faster than the enemy could destroy it. When the smoke cleared, the Bulge became more than Germany's last offensive, and it became a case study in the supremacy of logistics. Future generals would study it not for Peiper's daring thrusts, but for the lesson that tactics divorced from supply are illusions. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine in the world, had been reduced to a force abandoning its finest tanks because it could not fuel them. In January 1945, as the Allies advanced toward the Rhine, and the outcome of the war was sealed, the Reich could no longer resist. Its factories lay in ruins, its skies were owned by Allied bombers, and its armies were crippled not just by defeat, but by starvation of resources. What remained was only the inevitable collapse. The story of Honsfeld, Stavelot, and Loglaise reminds us of a truth as old as war itself. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And Germany gambled on brilliance and audacity, but America invested in supply lines, convoys, and reserves. The result was written on the roads of Belgium, and where thousands of German soldiers trudged home on foot, leaving their armored giants behind as mute memorials to a war already lost. And the Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last throw of the dice. But dice are not enough when war is measured in gallons, tons, and miles. And the Allies did not just win with courage. They won with supply. They won because in modern war, logistics is not just the lifeblood of victory. It is victory itself. The engine of the Tiger tank coughed, rattled, and died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the hatch, and the metallic echo slicing through the frozen dawn. His driver tried again to coax the Maybach's 700 horsepower engine back to life. Nothing. The reserve was dry. Peiper climbed out, boots crunching on the icy ground. Before him stretched the spearhead of the Waffen, SS and 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's best soldiers assembled for Hitler's last gamble. The Ardennes offensive. Yet this armored giant stood paralyzed, and not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks. Through the mist lay Honsfeld, a small American supply point, and the 99th Infantry Division had fled in such haste they left fires still burning in barrels, coffee steaming in cups, and rows upon rows of jerrycans stacked in neat columns. Nearly 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline sat abandoned, and enough to push Peiper's entire force to the Meuse River. His men scrambled to refuel, but as Peiper surveyed the bounty, a grim realization struck him. And if the Americans could afford to leave behind what Germany guarded with entire divisions, the war was already lost. Months earlier, and Albert Speer had warned Hitler that Germany's fuel industry was collapsing. In April 1944, synthetic plants produced 175,000 tons by September, and barely 5,000. Allied bombing had reduced entire complexes to rubble. The Reich was trying to wage mechanized war on horse-drawn supply. Meanwhile, the United States pumped 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944. Germany managed only 33 million. The comparison was absurd, and less than 2% of America's output. The Ardennes plan itself revealed desperation. Hitler's generals knew their reserves were inadequate. The offensive required 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. At best, they had half that amount delivered to the front. From the start, and their hopes rested not on their own supply lines, but on capturing Allied stockpiles. It was a strategy of necessity, not strength. The Americans, by contrast, treated logistics as science. Pipelines under the Channel pumped millions of gallons directly into France. The Red Ball Express delivered 500 tons of supplies daily. By December, U.S. and forces in Europe consumed 1.2 million gallons of fuel each day, and still built reserves, where German tanks rationed every drop, and American convoys swam in abundance. On December 18th, near Stavelot, Peiper thought salvation had come again. 3 million gallons stored in massive tanks, and enough to fuel not just his group but entire armies. Yet as his vanguard closed in, U.S. engineers set the depot ablaze. Explosions roared, and flames leapt into the sky, and 3 million gallons became a firestorm that lit the night like a second sun. Peiper and his officers could only watch. That inferno was more than burning gasoline. It was the destruction of Germany's last chance. The Americans could torch such wealth without hesitation, and, knowing it barely dented their reserves, Germany, starving for every drop, could do nothing but stare at the smoke that marked the collapse of their hopes. By December 20th, the advance faltered. Tanks were abandoned, not destroyed by enemy fire, but silenced by empty tanks. At Malmedy, and Peiper's men executed over 80 American prisoners. The massacre only steeled American resolve. Troops dug in harder, fought with vengeance, and delayed him at every crossroad. Each day worsened the arithmetic. By December 22nd, nearly half his armor lay scattered along the roadsides, and at Stoumont and Troyes Ponts, American counterattacks and destroyed bridges blocked him at every turn. Reinforcements never arrived. The roads were clogged, and, the skies owned by Allied aircraft, the promised convoys nothing but illusions. By Christmas Eve, Peiper's force was trapped in La Glaise. Surrounded and out of fuel, low on ammunition, they faced annihilation. Relief never came. On the night of December 24th, Peiper gave the order, and abandon everything and escape on foot. Crews sabotaged their Tigers, poured water into engines, and left behind 135 armored vehicles. And the once feared spearhead of the Waffen, SS, vanished into the forests like fugitives. After 4 days of trudging through snow, harried by patrols, and fewer than 800 men returned. From 5,000 soldiers and 67 tanks, nothing remained but survivors with frostbitten hands and empty eyes. And the collapse of Kampfgruppe Peiper symbolized the collapse of Hitler's gamble. The Ardennes offensive had begun with boldness but ended with starvation, and the broader war was already decided. In 1944, the United States produced more trucks than Germany produced rifles, and Detroit built more tanks than the entire Reich. Oil from Texas and California drowned Allied armies in gasoline, and, while German divisions begged for captured cans, for every German shell, the Americans fired 5. For every gallon the Wehrmacht dreamed of, and the Americans consumed 10 without hesitation. The Battle of the Bulge proved what had always been true: logistics decides wars. And Peiper's tanks were not destroyed in battle. They died in silence, abandoned with dry tanks. And his men did not surrender because of cowardice. They starved because supply lines could not feed them. Technology without fuel was junk, and valor without supply was futility. Strategy without logistics was fantasy. When the Bulge collapsed, Hitler's last throw of the dice came to nothing. Germany's losses, 600 tanks, 100,000 men, irreplaceable resources, left the Reich broken beyond repair, and never again would it mount an offensive in the West. The Americans rolled toward the Rhine, their convoys flowing endlessly, their depots overflowing, and their industrial might crushing illusions of Nazi victory. The lesson of Honsfeld, Stavelot, and La Glaise is clear: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Germany gambled on audacity, America invested in supply. The result was written on frozen Belgian roads, and where the mightiest panzers were left behind, mute memorials to a nation that tried to fight a modern war without the fuel to sustain it. And the Battle of the Bulge was not just the Reich's last offensive. It was the triumph of logistics over desperation, of supply over scarcity, and it proved once and for all that in modern war, logistics is not just the lifeblood of victory. Logistics is victory itself. The Ardennes offensive was more than just a battle in the snow. It was a reckoning. For years, and Hitler had sustained his armies on illusion. The illusion that willpower could replace industry, that audacity could substitute for fuel, and that strategy could overcome arithmetic. But war is merciless to illusions. In the forests of Belgium, reality finally demanded its payment. Every gallon mattered. German commanders rationed fuel like treasure. Tanks sat idle while officers debated which units could spare a few liters. And entire operations were decided not by tactics, but by whether supply trucks could make it through the bombed-out rail system still struggling to function inside the Reich. Soldiers siphoned fuel from abandoned vehicles, sometimes fighting among themselves for a canister. It was war reduced to scavenging. On the American side, the picture was altogether different. Soldiers knew shortages, but their shortages were of comfort, not of fuel. And when a Sherman's tank commander called for gasoline, he got it. When an infantry unit asked for artillery, the shells rained down in abundance. And convoys thundered along the roads day and night, headlights blacked out, tires throwing mud as they carried supplies forward without pause. And each truckload represented more than material. It represented certainty. Certainty that no matter how hard the Germans fought, and the Allies could always replace what was lost. This certainty was devastating for morale on both sides. For German soldiers, and the sight of abandoned tigers and panthers along the road was a constant reminder of futility. For Americans, every fuel dump, every endless convoy, reinforced the sense of unstoppable momentum. Wars are fought not only with weapons, but with belief. And the Ardennes destroyed German belief and reinforced the Allied conviction that victory was inevitable. The truth was larger still. By 1944, America had become the arsenal not just of democracy, but of the modern age. Its factories ran night and day, turning out ships, planes, trucks, and guns, and above all fuel. In Texas, oil derricks rose like forests. In California, refineries worked around the clock. And tankers crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys. And behind every soldier at the front stood entire divisions of workers, engineers, and planners who ensured that the flow never stopped. The United States waged war as an industrial civilization, and while Germany waged it as a desperate gambler with an empty wallet. And Albert Speer himself admitted after the war that the decisive blow was not any single battle, but the destruction of German fuel production. When the Allies bombed Luna, Politz, and Bleckhammer, and they did more than drop explosives, they dismantled the very possibility of German mechanized warfare. Tanks without fuel are statues, and aircraft without aviation gasoline are carcasses of aluminum. Every raid that reduced synthetic output tightened the noose around the Wehrmacht, and until it entered the Ardennes with hopes rather than reserves. The irony is that Germany had once mastered the art of operational warfare. In 1940, Blitzkrieg had stunned the world, but by 1944, Blitzkrieg was impossible without fuel. And the very weapon that had made the Wehrmacht terrifying had been stolen by scarcity. Instead of rapid thrusts across open plains, the Ardennes saw stalled engines, abandoned machines, and exhausted men marching through snow on foot. Blitzkrieg had become a death march, and the Americans had learned the lesson well. They knew that speed and firepower meant nothing without the constant heartbeat of supply. And the Red Ball Express manned large group of African-American drivers who endured exhaustion and danger, became the real spearhead of Allied power. Without them, Patton's tanks could not have raced across France, Eisenhower's armies could not have pressed into Germany, and the Battle of the Bulge could not have been contained. Their contribution, often overlooked, was as decisive as any general's plan, and even the geography of the Ardennes told the story. Narrow, icy roads, villages built centuries before automobiles, and hills and forests. This terrain punished any army that relied on fuel-hungry vehicles. For the Americans, it was an inconvenience. For the Germans, it was death. Each detour cost gallons they could not spare. Each delay drained tanks that could never be refueled. The Ardennes was not just a battlefield. It was a trap designed by logistics itself. By January 1945, the dream was shattered. The Bulge had been erased, and German forces limped back to their lines with nothing to show but ruin. Hitler had squandered his last reserves in a final gamble, and the Reich could no longer recover. From that point on, the Allies advanced relentlessly, fueled by a supply chain that never broke. Within 4 months, Berlin itself would fall, and yet the human cost remained staggering. For the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest single campaign of the war in Europe. Nearly 90,000 casualties were sustained in those frozen forests, and for the Germans, losses were even worse: 1,000 men, 600 tanks, irreplaceable planes and fuel. Civilians in Belgium suffered bitterly, and their towns shattered, their lives would once again by armies clashing across their doorsteps. And the cost of logistics is measured not only in tons and gallons, but in the lives it consumes along the way. Still, the lesson endures. And war is a contest not only of courage but of capacity. Strategy may win a battle, but logistics wins a war. And from the Roman legions who marched on roads built for supply, to Napoleon who learned that an army marches on its stomach, and to the Ardennes where Germany's mightiest tanks froze silent in the snow, history repeats the truth with relentless clarity. In modern times, and the echoes remain, nations that forget logistics invite disaster. Armies that chase bold maneuvers without supply chains collapse in exhaustion. And those who understand that the true battlefield lies in ports, pipelines, factories, and convoys will always hold the advantage. And the abandoned tigers at Laglais, rusting in silence, are more than relics. They are monuments to a truth that outlasts any war in the end. And it is not the brilliance of plans, the ferocity of soldiers, or even the power of weapons that decides history. It is whether those weapons can move, fire, and be fed. It is whether the lifelines of war remain unbroken. The Battle of the Bulge revealed this with brutal clarity. Germany gambled on chance. America invested in certainty. And certainty, in the form of gasoline trucks, pipelines, and endless convoys, proved stronger than any Tiger tank or Panzer division. In the snow-covered forests of Belgium, where men fought and froze, and where villages burned and convoys roared, the final truth of the Second World War was written: logistics is not merely the lifeblood of war, and it is the war itself. The Battle of the Bulge did not end in triumph for Germany. It ended in silence. The silence of abandoned tanks, frozen on the roadside, and their engines lifeless and their crews gone. The silence of men marching back across the Rhine, broken, exhausted, and carrying the weight of a dream that had turned to dust. And the silence of Hitler himself, who in his bunker raged against reality, and even as the Reich itself collapsed around him. For the Allies, the silence was different. It was the silence of relief, and of men emerging from forests where the snow was still stained with blood. It was the silence of graves freshly dug in Belgium's fields, and where American boys who had crossed an ocean to fight lay side by side beneath wooden crosses. It was the silence of resolve, for they knew that the end was now only months away. The Ardennes was more than a battle. It was the last gasp of a regime that refused to admit defeat. And Hitler believed that boldness could outweigh weakness, that daring could overcome arithmetic, that one strike could fracture the Allied will. But he miscalculated. He underestimated not just the soldiers facing him, but the machine behind them. That machine was logistics. Not glamorous, not heroic, but relentless. It was the Red Ball Express, roaring through the night, carrying fuel and ammunition. It was the factory worker in Detroit, tightening bolts on an endless line of trucks. It was the oil fields in Texas, the pipelines across England, the convoys crossing the Atlantic, and it was the invisible army of drivers, loaders, mechanics, and planners. Without them, the Ardennes might have been a victory. With them, Germany never had a chance. History is often told in terms of generals and battles, but the truth lies deeper. And Napoleon once said an army marches on its stomach. In the Ardennes, the German army starved on its tanks. Blitzkrieg had run on fuel. Without it, it could not breathe. America understood that wars are not won by single strokes, but by endless supply. By the ability to fight today, tomorrow, and every day after until the enemy can fight no longer. The lesson is eternal. Courage matters. Leadership matters. But without supply, and without the quiet miracle of logistics, courage burns out and leadership collapses. Germany had brave soldiers. They had formidable tanks. They had commanders who understood tactics with brilliance. But they had no fuel. And so their war ended not with thunder, but with the quiet sputter of engines that would never start again. When you stand today in the Ardennes, the forest seems peaceful, the villages rebuilt, and the roads quiet. But scattered across the land are monuments that tell the story. Stone memorials where men stood and refused to break, and museums that house the rusting hulks of Tigers and Shermans. Cemeteries where rows of white crosses and stars of David stretch to the horizon. And these places remind us that history is not theory. It is blood and sacrifice and the choices of nations. And the abandoned German tanks in Lays are more than relics. They are warnings. Warnings that arrogance is fatal, that overreach leads to ruin, and that any leader who ignores reality will meet reality in the harshest way. Hitler's gamble was not just lost, it was doomed from the start. And the Ardennes showed the world that no army, however fierce, can overcome the iron laws of supply and endurance. And yet, it also showed the resilience of men. And American soldiers, caught in surprise, outnumbered, outgunned, stood fast. They endured freezing nights in foxholes, cut off from supplies, and surrounded by enemies. They fought in Bastogne, where paratroopers famously answered German demands for surrender with a single word: nuts. They fought not for glory, but because they had to hold. And when the supply lines caught up, when the fuel arrived, and when the artillery came to life, the stand turned the tide. The Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. But for the Allies, and it was proof that they could the hardest blow and still stand. That resilience, that refusal to break, was the beginning of the end. 4 months later, and Berlin would fall. The Reich that promised 1,000 years ended in 12. So what is the lesson for us today? And it is that no victory comes without preparation. That strength is not built in the moment of crisis, but in the years before it. And America won not only because of courage on the battlefield, but because of foresight in the factories, the oil fields, the shipping lanes. And they invested in the unseen, and when the moment came, the unseen delivered victory. For anyone listening, remember this, and the world often glorifies the flashy strike, the bold maneuver, the daring leap. But history is decided by the patient, by those who prepare, and by those who build the foundation long before the test arrives. Success, in war, in life, in anything, belongs not to the gambler, but to the builder. And the Ardennes was the grave of German ambition. It was also the proof of Allied endurance, and it remains, to this day, one of the clearest lessons of history. And without supply, without preparation, without the quiet strength behind the scenes, no battle can be won. As you watch this story, and as you reflect on the frozen forests, the abandoned tanks, the endless convoys of trucks, ask yourself, where does true power lie? And it lies not in arrogance, not in desperation, not in the illusion of shortcuts. It lies in endurance, in preparation, in the steady and patient building of strength. And that is the story of the Battle of the Bulge. Not just a clash of armies, but the triumph of preparation over gamble, and of endurance over illusion, of reality over arrogance. If this history has moved you, if it has reminded you of the sacrifice of those who came before, and if it has given you a glimpse into the truth that wars are won not by dreams but by discipline, then carry it forward. Keep the memory alive. And if you want to join us as we tell more stories like this, stories of courage, of failure, and of lessons written in blood and steel, then make sure to like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe for more journeys into the past. Because history is not dead, it speaks. And when it speaks, it reminds us the past is never far away. And it is a guide, a warning, and sometimes an inspiration. So let the tanks rust in silence, let the forest grow quiet once again, but let the lesson remain. Logistics is victory. Preparation is destiny. And history always remembers those who endure.